Adaeze Obiora had exactly 24 hours left when she dropped the tray of glasses at table 9 and started crying in front of the entire restaurant. The manager was already walking toward her with that look on his face, the one that meant another write-up, another warning, another step closer to losing the only job keeping her family from disaster. But Adaeze wasn't crying about the glasses. She was crying because her phone had buzzed 4 times in the last hour, and every single text was from the hospital in Lagos, where her mother lay connected to machines that cost more per day than Adaeze made in a month. The transplant board had given her family a deadline. Pay the outstanding balance by midnight tomorrow, or her mother's name came off the donor list entirely. $340,000. Adaeze had $2,700 in her checking account and a waitressing job in Atlanta that barely covered her own rent. If you've ever been one impossible phone call away from losing everything, you already know exactly how this feels. And if you want to see how a desperate waitress ends up married to Korea's most feared syndicate boss by sunrise, hit that subscribe button right now because this story does not slow down. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and kept moving because that's what she always did. Kept moving, kept working, kept pretending the ground beneath her wasn't cracking. She'd come to America 4 years ago on a nursing scholarship that fell through in her second semester when the program lost funding. And instead of going home defeated, she'd stayed, worked 2 jobs, sent money back to Lagos every single month, and told herself that eventually things would get easier. They never did. Her father had died 3 years ago from a stroke that could have been prevented if they'd had insurance. Her younger brother Chidi was 17 and brilliant, and terrified he'd lose his mother the same way. And now the hospital was telling her that all of it, every sacrifice, every missed meal, every double shift, meant nothing unless she found $340,000 by midnight tomorrow. She was refilling water glasses at the private dining room in the back when the door opened, and 6 men in dark suits walked in ahead of one man who didn't need a suit to look dangerous. Kang Jaewon moved like the room already belonged to him, because in every practical sense, it did. He owned the building the restaurant sat in. He owned 3 more like it across the city. He was the head of the Kang syndicate, a name that made grown businessmen change their schedules to avoid crossing paths with him. And he was in Atlanta for exactly one reason: to finalize an alliance with a rival Korean family, an alliance that required, according to decades-old tradition his own grandmother still enforced, that he be married before the ink dried on the contract. He had 11 hours to find a wife or lose an alliance that kept a war from breaking out between 2 syndicates that controlled half the shipping routes on the East Coast. Adaeze didn't know any of that. She only knew that the man at the head of the table kept staring at her every time she came near, and that his stare wasn't the kind she was used to from wealthy men who thought waitresses existed for their entertainment. This was something else, something calculating. When she came to clear his plate, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear, "You were crying earlier." She froze. "I'm sorry, sir, it won't happen again." "That's not what I asked." Adaeze looked at him properly for the first time, and something in his eyes made her chest tighten, not with attraction, not yet, but with the unsettling feeling of being truly seen by someone who missed nothing. "My mother is dying," she said, because she was too exhausted to lie. "And I can't save her." Jaewon set down his water glass slowly. "How much do you need?" "It doesn't matter. It's not something you can just—" "How much?" she told him, mostly to make him stop looking at her like that. $340,000. He nodded once, like she'd told him the weather forecast, and said 5 words that would change the entire trajectory of her life. "Marry me by midnight tomorrow." If you think that's a wild proposal, wait until you hear what happens after she says yes, because this story is just getting started, and the real danger hasn't even shown up yet. Drop a comment right now telling me if you would have said yes in her position, and make sure that like button is smashed before we go any further. She laughed at first, actual disbelieving laughter, because surely this was some cruel joke rich men played on desperate women. But Jaewon didn't laugh. He explained it plainly, without softening any of it. He needed a wife by midnight the next day, or his family's alliance with the Choi syndicate would collapse. And that collapse meant blood in the streets between 2 organizations that had kept an uneasy peace for 11 years. He needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't fall in love with him, wouldn't complicate his life further than it already was. In exchange, He would clear every cent of her mother's medical debt and guarantee the transplant went forward. A contract, 2 years minimum, full legal marriage, not performance, but no expectation of anything beyond appearances and mutual non-interference. She had 11 hours to decide. Adaeze thought about her mother's face the last time she'd video called her, thin and yellow and trying so hard to smile for her daughter's sake. She thought about Chitty, who'd stopped eating properly since their mother got sick because he was saving money without telling anyone. She thought about every door that had closed in her face since she arrived in this country. And she said yes. The wedding happened at 11:40 that night in a private room at the county courthouse that Jaewon's people had somehow arranged after hours, judge and all, because money like his didn't wait in lines. Adaeze wore the black dress she'd worn to her father's funeral because it was the nicest thing she owned, and Jaewon didn't comment on it, just looked at her steadily as the judge read words that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. When it was done, he handed her a phone. "The hospital has already been contacted. The balance clears tonight. Your mother goes on the active transplant list within the hour." Adaeze sat down hard on a courthouse bench and cried again, but this time it wasn't despair. It was the terrifying relief of watching the ground stop cracking beneath her feet, even if she had no idea what she'd just built her new life on top of. She found out 3 days later, standing in the marble foyer of his Buckhead estate with security cameras in every corner and men with earpieces stationed at the gates, that her husband wasn't just wealthy. He was the reason 2 rival organizations hadn't gone to war in over a decade. She found out because his grandmother, Kang Sunhee, arrived unannounced that morning, took one look at Adaeze, and said something in Korean to Jaewon that made his jaw tighten before he translated it for her, mostly, she suspected, out of politeness rather than honesty. "She wants to know if you understand what you've married into." Adaeze straightened her spine the way her mother had taught her. "I understand I saved my mother's life. Everything else I'm learning as I go." Sunhee studied her for a long moment, then something almost like approval flickered across her face before she turned and left without another word. Jaewon watched his grandmother go, then looked at Adaeze with an expression she couldn't quite place. "That went better than I expected." The house came with rules Adaeze had to memorize fast. Never open the front gate herself. Never discuss Jaewon's business, not with staff, not with guests, not on the phone. Always let the security detail clear a room before she entered it. The staff were kind but distant, watching her with the careful curiosity of people who'd seen temporary arrangements come and go and weren't sure yet what category she fell into. She missed her tiny apartment sometimes, missed the noise of her old neighborhood, missed being invisible in a way that felt safer than the constant awareness that eyes were always on her now. But there were quiet moments too, moments that snuck up on her before she realized what they were building toward. Jaewon, still in his shirt sleeves at midnight, standing in the kitchen because he couldn't sleep, teaching her badly how to make his grandmother's kimchi jjigae, because the staff cook had gone home for the night, and he was hungry and didn't know how to ask for help gracefully. Adaeze correcting his knife technique with the same patience she used to teach her brother, and Jaewon actually laughing, a real laugh, surprised out of him like he hadn't expected to still be capable of it. She started leaving small things for him. A plate of jollof rice on the counter with a note that said, "Trade you," because she wanted him to taste her home the way she was learning to taste his. He started noticing when she was tired before she said anything, started having the driver take the long route past the Ethiopian and Nigerian restaurants downtown because he'd overheard her mention missing certain foods. Neither of them said what any of it meant. Both of them were too busy protecting the walls they'd built to survive their own particular kinds of hell. Then his enemies made their first move. And if you thought the danger was over after the wedding, you have no idea what's coming. So make sure you're subscribed because this next part is where everything gets complicated. His name was Marcus Delgado, and he ran the distribution network that fed half the illegal shipments moving through the ports Jaewon's family controlled, until 8 months ago when Jaewon cut him out entirely for skimming profits and lying about it. Delgado had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back, and a new wife, an American wife with no security training and no understanding of the world she'd married into, looked exactly like the opening he needed. Adaeze was leaving a grocery store, alone, against every rule she'd been given, because she'd wanted 5 minutes of feeling like a normal person again, when a black SUV pulled up too close and 2 men got out fast. She didn't scream. She'd grown up in Lagos, in a neighborhood where you learned early that screaming got you nothing but attention from the wrong people. So instead she threw the gallon of milk she was carrying directly into the first man's face and ran, cutting through the parking garage stairwell instead of the open lot, buying herself the 90 seconds she needed for Yiwon's security detail, alerted by the panic button sewn into her coat that she hadn't even known was there. To arrive and put both men on the ground before they got within 10 feet of her again, Yiwon arrived at the house 20 minutes later, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move, and when he found her sitting in the kitchen, shaking but unharmed, something raw crossed his face before he could control it. "You could have died. I know. This is exactly why there are rules. I know that too." He knelt in front of her chair, his hands hovering like he wanted to check her for injuries, but didn't know if he had the right to touch her like that yet. "Adaeze, I need you to understand something. This isn't a game. The people who want to hurt me will use anyone connected to me to do it, and I can't." His voice actually caught. "I can't lose someone else because of what I am." Adaeze looked at him and saw, for the first time, the boy underneath the boss, the one who'd clearly lost someone before and never forgiven himself for it. "Who did you lose?" He told her about his older sister, Minji, who'd been killed 12 years ago in a rival attack meant for their father, back before Yiwon inherited the organization. Back when he was 22 and idealistic enough to believe he could reform the family business from the inside instead of ruling it with the same iron control that had kept it alive for 3 generations. He'd blamed himself every day since. That was why the rules existed. That was why the walls existed. Adaeze reached out and took his hand, the first time she'd initiated any real contact between them, and said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere. But you have to actually let me in if you want to protect me, because I can't follow rules I don't understand the reasons for." Something shifted in him that night. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music swelling, no sudden kiss. Just 2 people who'd both survived things they didn't talk about, choosing, slowly, to let each other closer. Marcus Delgado didn't disappear after his failed kidnapping attempt. Men like him never do. 2 weeks later, financial auditors showed up at 3 of Yiwon's legitimate front businesses, claiming irregularities that Yiwon knew immediately were fabricated, planted evidence designed to draw federal attention, exactly when his alliance with the Choi family was at its most fragile. Someone had tipped off the authorities, and it took Yiwon's people 4 days of digging to discover it was Delgado working with a corrupt city councilman who owed him favors. Yiwon handled it the way Adaeze was learning he handled everything, with cold precision instead of visible rage, dismantling Delgado's remaining shipping contracts one by one until the man had no money left to bribe anyone with. But Delgado wasn't finished. He never would be until one of them was gone completely, and Adaeze was starting to understand that marrying into this family hadn't just given her a husband. It had given her a target on her back that would follow her for the rest of her life. If you're invested in whether these 2 make it out of this alive, comment Team Yiwon and Adaeze right now, because the middle of this story is about to get a lot more dangerous. And I promise you the twist coming up is not what you're expecting. The real betrayal came from somewhere Adaeze never suspected. Sunhee, Yiwon's grandmother, had a second grandson, Yiwon's cousin Do-yeon, who'd spent his entire life being told he was the backup heir, the spare who'd never actually run anything as long as Yiwon breathed. Do-yeon had been quietly building his own relationships with the Choi family behind Yiwon's back for over a year, positioning himself as an alternative should Yiwon's marriage arrangement fail, or should Yiwon himself become. As he put it in a recorded conversation, Yiwon's men eventually uncovered. Unavailable. Do-yeon was the one who'd tipped off Delgado about the wedding timeline in the first place, hopping the scandal of Yiwon marrying a random American waitress in a rushed courthouse ceremony would embarrass the family enough to shift the succession conversation in his favor. When Adaeze survived the kidnapping attempt and the marriage held strong instead of falling apart under pressure, Do-yeon's plan collapsed, and in his desperation, he made his biggest mistake. He went to Sunhee directly and told her Adaeze was a plant, an American operative working with federal investigators, feeding her actual falsified documents to back up the claim. Sunhee summoned Adaeze alone, no Yiwon, no translator, just the two of them in the tea room at the back of the estate, and slid the fabricated documents across the table without a word. Adaeze read them, felt her stomach drop, and then looked directly into the old woman's eyes. "These are lies. I don't know who made them, but I've never spoken to a federal agent in my life, and you can check every phone record I have because I have nothing to hide." Sunhee studied her for a long, silent moment, the same way she had the very first day. Then she said something that surprised Adaeze more than any threat could have. "I know they are lies. I had them verified this morning." "Then why show me?" "Because I wanted to see if you would panic or if you would tell me the truth." Sunhee's expression softened, barely, into something almost like respect. "Do-yeon has made a very serious error. Jaewon needs to know exactly what his cousin has been doing, and he needs to hear it from you, because you are the one Do-yeon tried to destroy." Jaewon's reaction, when Adaeze told him everything that night, was quieter and more frightening than anything she'd witnessed from him before. He didn't yell. He made 3 phone calls in a voice so level it made the hair on Adaeze's arms stand up. And by morning, Do-yeon had been formally removed from any position within the organization, stripped of access, stripped of protection, and quietly informed that his continued safety depended entirely on his continued silence and distance. It wasn't violence. Jaewon had learned, painfully, over years of running this family, that destroying someone financially and socially was often more effective and less costly than destroying them physically. But Adaeze understood, watching him make those calls, exactly why grown men rearranged their schedules to avoid crossing him. That night, after everything, after Do-yeon's betrayal and Sunhee's quiet vindication and the exhausting weight of surviving another attack on her life, Adaeze found Jaewon standing alone on the back terrace, staring out at the dark garden like he was trying to find something in it that wasn't there. "You didn't have to defend me the way you did," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his guard was completely down. "Because somewhere in the last 3 months, this stopped being an arrangement, Adaeze. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I look at you and I don't see a contract anymore. I see someone I would burn this entire empire down to protect, and that terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced." Adaeze's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I didn't want to. I told myself I wouldn't, but I do." He reached up and touched her face, gentle in a way that felt almost unbearable given everything he was capable of. And when he kissed her, it felt like the only inevitable thing that had happened since the moment he'd walked into that restaurant and asked her how much she needed. But right when everything seemed like it was finally healing, the story takes its darkest turn. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, hit subscribe now because this is where everything almost falls apart completely. Delgado's final move came 3 weeks later, and it was the cruelest one yet. He couldn't get to Jaewon directly, couldn't get to Adaeze without triggering the full force of the syndicate's retaliation, so he went after the one person who had no protection at all. Adaeze's mother, still recovering in Lagos from her transplant surgery, guarded by nothing but hospital staff who had no idea what danger existed on the other side of the world. Delgado's people made contact with the hospital administration, threatening to expose falsified insurance documentation that would strip Adaeze's mother of her post-op care, unless Jaewon paid an impossible ransom, and more importantly, publicly dissolved his organization's shipping monopoly in the ports Delgado wanted back. It was blackmail dressed up as a business demand, and it worked exactly the way Delgado intended, because Jaewon, for the first time since Adaeze had known him, looked genuinely lost. "I can pay him," Jaewon said, packing his study at 3 a.m. while Adaeze sat frozen on the couch. "But if I give him back those ports, I break my agreement with the Choi family, and that agreement is the only thing standing between us and open war. People will die, Adaeze. A lot of people. And if you don't pay him, my mother could lose her care after everything we already sacrificed to save her life." Neither of them said the words out loud, but the weight of the impossible choice sat in the room like a third presence. Adaeze stood up, and something in her had gone very still and very clear. "Then we don't play his game at all. We expose him." "What do you mean?" "You've been trying to beat Delgado using your rules, quiet retaliation, financial dismantling, careful moves that don't draw attention. But he's not playing by those rules anymore. He's threatening a dying woman on another continent, so let's stop being careful." She looked at her husband with a fire he hadn't seen from her before. Let's burn him down publicly, all of it, the falsified documents, the corrupt councilman, the kidnapping attempt, everything, and let the whole city watch it happen. It took 4 days to build the case properly, gathering every piece of evidence Jaewon's people had collected over months. Cross-referencing it with financial records Adaeze herself helped comb through late into the night. Her sharp mind for detail, honed by years of tracking every cent that came in and out of her family's survival, proving more valuable than either of them expected. When they were ready, they didn't go to the police first. They went to the press, a carefully selected investigative journalist who Jaewon's legitimate business interests had cultivated a relationship with for exactly this kind of situation, handing over evidence of Delgado's corruption, his blackmail attempt against a hospital patient, his years of illegal shipping fraud, everything laid bare in a story that broke across every major outlet within 48 hours. Delgado was arrested before he even understood what hit him, and the corrupt councilman who'd been protecting him resigned in disgrace the same week. Adaeze's mother's care was never actually in danger once the hospital administration realized they'd been threatened by a man now facing federal charges. But the terror of those 4 days left a mark on Adaeze that she knew would take a long time to fade. The morning after Delgado's arrest made the news, Jaewon found Adaeze sitting in the garden, exhausted but finally still. He sat down beside her without saying anything at first, just took her hand the way she'd taken his months before, back when neither of them knew what they were building. "You saved us," he said quietly. "You saved us both, and you did it because you refused to let fear make the decision for you. My sister would have loved you." It was the highest compliment he knew how to give, and Adaeze understood exactly what it meant to him. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "I couldn't have. Not the old version of me, the one who was drowning in bills and too scared to ask for help. You gave me somewhere solid to stand, Jaewon. That's what let me fight." 6 months later, Adaeze's mother arrived in Atlanta for the first time, strong enough now to travel, strong enough to hold her daughter and new son-in-law in a hug that lasted a full minute while Chitty, now enrolled in an engineering program Jaewon had quietly funded without ever mentioning it, stood grinning beside them. Sunny hosted the welcome dinner herself, insisting on preparing dishes that blended both families' traditions: jollof rice beside japchae, egusi soup next to bulgogi. And when Adaeze's mother tasted the food and looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes, saying she'd never imagined this life for her Adaeze, but that she was grateful beyond words for every person in that room, Adaeze felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the day her father died. Jaewon proposed again 8 months after their courthouse wedding, this time with no contract, no deadline, no impossible clock ticking down. Just a ring and a question asked with the same steady voice he'd used the very first night, except this time his hands were shaking. Adaeze said yes again, for real this time, and as the whole extended family, the Kang side and the Obiora side, gathered together for a proper wedding under string lights in the same garden where he'd once told her his darkest secret, Adaeze thought about the woman crying over a broken tray of glasses 11 months earlier, terrified and out of options, and she barely recognized her anymore. Not because that woman had disappeared, but because she'd finally been given the chance to become everything she was always capable of being. If this story moved you, if you were rooting for Adaeze and Jaewon from that very first proposal, let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on because we have so many more stories like this one coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next story.